Hello and good afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone to today's Envoy Conversations event. We have a great session ahead of us, but before we get there are a few housekeeping items I would like to go over. First, today's session is being recorded and all attendees will receive a copy of this recording. The link to view and/or download will be sent out after today's live event. So please keep an eye out on your inboxes tomorrow afternoon for that message. If for whatever reason you do not receive it, just please let us know and we'll be sure to send you the link to the recording. We also encourage all attendees to ask some questions throughout the event. To do so, you can type your questions in via the GoToWebinar question box that you should see on your screen, and we'll try to get to your question at the end of the main discussion. Finally, please excuse any audio or video interruptions that may occur as a result of internet connections. And moving on, I'd like to talk a little bit about Envoy Global for those that are unfamiliar with us. For nearly 20 years, Envoy has been on a mission to fix the inefficient, frustrating, and confusing immigration process. Envoy combines top-ranked legal teams with innovative technology to deliver the only platform that makes it seamless for companies to hire, mobilize, and manage a global workforce. Envoy secures work authorization in over 100 countries, has grown 37% year over year, and we work with over 1,000 customers. We are particularly proud of our NPS score, which is a testament to the employee experience that we provide. And I'd like to introduce the moderator today, my colleague, Greg Legal, who is Envoy's Director of Product Management, where he oversees product management, design, and training. Prior to joining Envoy, Greg co-founded a predictive analytics startup and held senior product roles at Yahoo. Greg holds a doctorate in sociology from the University of Chicago, where his research focused on organizational change, technology strategy, and high-skilled immigration. And with that, Greg, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thanks, Eric. And thanks to all of you who are joining us here today. We really appreciate you making the time for us. As Eric sort of alluded to, we're going to spend about the next 45 minutes or so talking about the current immigration policies that have been implemented by the Trump administration, as well as those that are being proposed by the Biden administration. And I think, from there, we're really going to segue into how does employment-based immigration reform, how can that actually help address, the country's economic needs, particularly coming out of this COVID pandemic and all the challenges that have come along with that. And to do that today, we've assembled an absolutely fantastic panel. I'm super excited to welcome them all here today. Britta, Stuart, and Giovanni are all leaders in their fields. They all work at this intersection between innovation, immigration, economics, and public policy. So incredibly excited to welcome you here. And to provide a little bit more introduction, I want to kind of run through quickly each one's bio, just to give a little more sense of where they're coming from in this. And so starting on my left, at least, we have Britta Glennon. Britta is an assistant professor at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and her research has been featured in publications like The Economist, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and Bloomberg. And those types of publications are going to be a constant theme across the folks that we're introducing here today. Next up, we have Stuart Anderson, who's the Executive Director of the National Foundation for American Policy, which is a nonpartisan public policy research organization focusing on trade, immigration, and other related issues. Prior to that, Stuart served as the Executive Associate Commissioner for Public Policy and Planning, as well as the counselor to the commissioner at the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Stuart's also spent 4.5 years on Capitol Hill on the Senate Immigration Subcommittee. And notwithstanding all that, he's also the author of a book entitled Immigration, and his work has also been prominently cited in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and other publications. And last, directly to my left here, at least at my screen, we have Giovanni Peri, who's joining us from California. Giovanni is a professor of economics at the University of California, Davis, and is also the founder and director of the Global Migration Center, as well as, like Britta, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Giovanni is also the co-editor of the Journal of the European Economic Association, and his research in turn has also been focused, or featured rather, in The Economist, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR News, and other leading media outlets. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us here today. I think we're going to have a really fantastic conversation. So to kick things off, I want to start here really on the sort of around this theme of how do we get here and how can immigration reform help move us forward. And so to really start with this, I'd like to start actually with you, Stuart, if we could. If we think about what's happened, over the last couple of years, right? Obviously, the immigration landscape is constantly changing, but immigration levels in the U.S. are really actually at historic lows right now. But conversely, the demand for skilled labor remains incredibly high. And if you think about it, global competition for top talent is just as strong in 2021 as it was when the COVID pandemic started. In fact, I was talking with a friend over in Germany just a couple of days ago, and they brought up that exact point, right? They're still struggling to find talent in the same way that a lot of my friends at other startups and other tech companies are also struggling to find that talent. So to sort of focus our discussion first, I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about what aspects of our current economic situation are really an unavoidable result of the pandemic and the steps necessary to mitigate its spread. And sort of leading out of that, if you could talk a little bit of how the last administration, how the Trump administration's immigration policies prior to and even during that pandemic have exacerbated the current situation. And then sort of to round that whole thing out, if you will, looking forward now to the Biden administration, right? The Biden administration has already taken a lot of interesting steps and seems like it may be a little bit more immigration friendly. So how can that immigration friendly Biden administration actually address these problems through comprehensive immigration reform? I know that's a lot to throw at you, so start wherever you want.
Yeah, so I can answer all that in about a sentence or two, I think.
Perfect.
I think it's an excellent question because there's really been an impact because of the coronavirus pandemic that is very diverse. I mean, you see, if you're a restaurant owner or supply services that involve employees that need to be on site, I think you've seen, those people have been hurt. I mean, the businesses have been hurt. But if you're in the tech sector and you're supplying services that people need and have needed in greater quantities because of the demand to stay out of an office or stay off the street or to not be in a restaurant and to be working remotely, you've actually, seen an increase in demand. And it shows in the data. I mean, we've been following very closely the computer occupations unemployment rate, both in a analysis that we created special at our think tank and also some of the broader statistics. And we actually found that the unemployment rate in computer occupations fell from before the pandemic started. And despite that, the Trump administration put these proclamations in effect that would stop H-1B visas and others. And I think our research played somewhat of a role in judges blocking some of these provisions, both the larger DHS regulation and the proclamation to block H-1Bs, because there was a claim that there was this emergency situation that affected tech workers, and that really hasn't been the case. You've seen them been really in many ways the least affected sector, and that's why the demand has continued. I mean, the Trump administration policy from the beginning, it first started with this Buy America, Hire America executive order, but also behind the scenes, there were these memos that were issued in which they were able to have adjudicators increase the denial rates without any change in the law or even in regulations. And so what we saw from tracking this is that the denial rates went from maybe about 6% for initial employment for H-1Bs in 2015 to over 24% in FY 2018, and then about 21% in 2019. But as companies started to fight back, you saw lawsuits on this really constrained and in many ways ludicrous definition of a specialty occupation. And those successful lawsuits forced adjudicators to pull back. In addition, the IT Serve Alliance litigation led to eventually a settlement with USCIS where they stopped the main policies that had gone after IT services companies in particular. And so what we found in the denial rates is up through the first 3 quarters of FY 2020, you had about 21% denial rate still for initial employment. In the fourth quarter, it dropped down to about 1%, about 1.5%, and that's mostly continued into the first quarter of FY 2021. And that's all because the Trump administration was forced to stop what judges term to be illegal policies. So for businesses, there's some relief in that the policies, those particular policies have ended. On the other hand, there's probably a lot of frustration that they had to go through 3 or almost 4 years of policies that were essentially illegal. And that was that they were, having so much difficulty. Now,
I think I read it in one of your recent Forbes pieces, right? It's not that the law changed at all. It's more that they were putting policies into place that actually had no basis in law whatsoever. We're having these sort of deleterious consequences.
Exactly, and some businesses, in the past have been afraid to go forward. I was on an international student call recently, and universities had been, afraid because of, the potential for retaliation on some of their issues. But, it turned out without litigation, the policies wouldn't have stopped. I mean, they would be in place today still. Now, on the Biden administration, which you asked about as well, I mean, so far, they haven't made any negative changes from the Trump administration policies, and the denial rates would generally continue lower. But there are 2 big hangover policies from the Trump administration. One is a rule that they made final that I think many attorneys think is unlawful, which would eliminate the H-1B lottery and replace that with a policy of highest salary to lowest salary. While in theory, economics would tell you, oh, isn't that good that you'd have highest lowest salary? In practice, what happens is that tends to favor veterans, senior people who've been in the labor market for a while, and it would very likely exclude many international students from being able to be hired afterwards. And so it'd be a really unusual policy for a country to adopt, to basically say, we don't want young talent. It'd be kind of a bizarre policy to adopt as a national policy, but that was the policy put into effect. And while the Biden administration has delayed that, there will almost certainly be litigation if it goes forward. And the other policy is the Department of Labor final wage rule, which we found the earlier version would have dramatically increased salaries that employers would be forced to pay. A judge set that aside, but the Trump administration issued a final rule on it in January, and we found that the effects are similar. They're not, quite as bad, but they're, you're still looking at, say, 25 to 40% increase in level 1 wages and some of the other levels as well, for depending on the occupation and the geographic region. So that's still a very significant impact. And the Biden administration has kind of held off on the rule, or put out a notice asking for comment on a delay of the rule, but they haven't made a decision yet, and they can't just stop the rule because it was made final. So it would have to be stopped either through a formal process of rescission, they'd or they could possibly, reissue the rule with changes, or a court could strike it down and it could be changed that way.
Yeah, no, I think, and you brought up a couple points there that sort of made me think. First off, the focus on, do we want to emphasize younger talents, right, who are just starting out in their careers, but also the impact on universities. And I know Britta and Giovanni, you both have done also quite a bit of work in that space. And so I was wondering, if you think about what Stuart was just referencing, right, so that U.S. colleges and universities have really suffered as a result of the administrations, or the previous administrations rather, stance on immigration. So everything from like the OPT crackdowns, increased regulations around the F&J visas that came out during the pandemic, and then as well as the increased scrutiny just around the wage levels for H-1B visas that Stuart actually just mentioned, right? We've seen the RFE rates have gone through the roof over the last few years and things like that. I think one of the effects that I know from looking at your work that has happened as a result of that really is that the STEM programs have really seen a decline in enrollment, particularly from foreign students, right? So I was wondering if you could spend a few minutes each really talking about how, President Biden's immigration agenda, such as we know it right now, how could that actually go ahead and improve enrollment for U.S. universities? How could that improve that aspect? Because so much of that STEM talent is in fact coming from overseas, right? It's not just coming from the United States itself. Britta, do you want to go first, and then we can turn it over to Giovanni?
Sure, happy to. Yeah. So, in my view, one of the main reasons why STEM programs and universities more generally have really seen a decline in foreign enrollment is due to uncertainty, right? So one of the main reasons why international students even come to the US to receive an education is because they're really trying to get a job afterwards, right? And when they can't be sure of their chances of getting hired afterwards, they're less likely to attend US universities to begin with, right? Especially if they have outside options, right? So if you think about the very best students in the world, they're likely to have also been accepted at other top universities, like in Canada or in Europe or Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, right? And if they don't feel welcome in the US, or if they feel as though their chances of employment are just not very high anymore, they're just not going to come, right? And research has shown already that this is particularly true for the best students, right? Because they have these outside options. And so then, what that suggests is that one of the best things that the Biden administration could really do is just to improve these school to work transitions, right? So this could be, through expanding the OPT program. It could be, even implementing an entirely new type of program or variation on existing ones, like guaranteeing work time to foreign students after graduation, maybe reserving some H-1B visas or even green cards for graduates of U.S. universities. These, of course, would require legislative changes, which are challenging, right? But even a simpler solution is just trying to improve procedural guidelines. So Stuart has already talked about, the increase in rejection rates, but also there were all kinds of additional hurdles that were added, right? So, more requests for evidence, longer adjudication times, more site visits, right? And so this is something that could be done kind of without legislative changes, just kind of streamlining the process, improving procedural guidelines, and that would also kind of help with this uncertainty dimension. And then, of course, just changing the image of the U.S. to more welcoming, right? So lots of foreign students are just turned off because they don't feel very welcome here.
Sure.
Yeah.
Giovanni, can you jump in there?
Yeah, I actually think that there are a few things that the Biden administration can do right away, and other which are going to be a little bit more complicated. But I want to start with a few facts, actually, and I think that this will be and should be the starting point for the Biden administration. For 4 years, we have done immigration policy ignoring the facts, ignoring the research, ignoring the data. So there has been a decline in students. We're talking about university. We're talking about visa for students. student, a decline in student visa already before the COVID from 2016, about 20-30%. So American universities have significantly reduced the number of international talent that they have been attracting. In large part, this has been due not to different legislation or new rules.
Yep, looks like we froze a little bit there.
But to these small hurdles, longer procedures, an attitude recognized and more objected to rather than embraced. So I think that the number one information and the number one base of the policy should be the recognition that the tertiary education system in the US is one incredibly important creator of job, creator of innovation. At the local level, there are estimates that says that one more university job or an expansion increases local opportunity and local jobs. And that American universities have been for a long time a attractor of world talent. In graduate studies, probably this has been going on for 20, 30 years, but now even in the undergraduate population. And the evidence is that the large part of this inflow has actually helped also the university to fund themselves to improve research. So I would say that the starting point should be for the Biden administration, say, look at the facts, look at the research, look at what impact this has on us, on our students, on our economy. And let's start thinking about that. The second thing is that there are a few things that can be done with executive order and by the Biden administration. I would say that this changing a little bit the mentality of the Department of Homeland Security and putting in key places people who have an eye to efficiency, to making this procedure more effective is important. And in the shorter run, there will be the reversal of some of these executive orders which have limited the number of J, the entrance of H-1B, and as COVID improves, this will happen. But after this, I think there are a couple of important questions which need to be tackled from a legislative point of view. And I do agree that the idea that the H-1B visa system is in need of some changes, and that in particular, there should be a particular eye for foreigners who get a degree in the US. There have been several proposals to try to attach either a green card or a visa to a STEM degree earned in the US by a foreign national. I think this should be something that we look into very carefully. And we need to have an eye also as a country on what other countries do, because as Britta was saying, these people are extremely mobile. And so it's not that by doing nothing, we're going to keep getting the students that we get. By doing nothing, we're going to continue to lose to Canada, to Australia, to the UK, to the European countries. And so this is definitely, there should be a sense of urgency in the administration about this.
Yeah, no, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think it's really interesting. Like, I started off my career actually working in Europe. And I think at that time, there was this huge focus on, you know, for friends over there, developers, other product managers, it's like, how can I get to the United States? I want to work in California. I want to work in New York. And now you have those same discussions, and very much it's like, why would I go there when I can go to Berlin, I can go to London, I can go to Madrid? They're rolling out the red carpet for me, right? They're creating not just visa pathways so that I can work and live there, but they're also creating other economic incentives to do that. And so they're creating like these little agglomeration economies in all these different areas. It's not just the United States anymore. And if we're not rolling out the red carpet for these folks, they do have those opportunities to certainly go elsewhere, right?
I agree 100%. Can I just interject one thing? I've always said that the US has this huge advantage, and I think it still has. Some of the great universities and the great companies in the world are still in the US. The immigration system should just not put hurdles in order for this to happen. And I would say that some system that allow these things to work as the market would allow would be a big improvement.
No, could not agree more. You know, I think one of the themes that's come out of the discussion so far is really how anti-immigration the Trump administration has been, right? And so if we think about, you know, I think there's something like 400 plus immigration-related executive orders that President Trump or former President Trump had made. Stuart, I wonder if you could speak for a few minutes about what are the ones that, for you at least, have really been the most detrimental to U.S. economic growth?
Well, I think when you look at economic growth, as economists know, you're looking at labor force growth and productivity growth. Giovanni's done excellent research showing how important H-1Bs have been to productivity growth in the United States. And on population growth, you're really talking about the number of people coming in. And so you'd really have to look at a whole series of policies. For example, preventing refugees from coming in. That's one of the areas where an administration has a lot of discretion. The Biden administration has talked about going back to really the more historical norms of refugee policies, closer to eventually over 100,000 a year. Whereas the Trump administration cut that down to really like 15,000 a year, or even less in terms of the people actually coming in, not to mention the values issues in which, people fleeing religious persecution really just weren't even being accepted anymore, except in very small numbers. Not even to mention people who helped us in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as risking their lives. They weren't even able to get approvals. So you have those other aspects, but on terms of economic growth, I mean, we calculated that if the current Trump administration policies, including these proclamation bans and things like the public charge rule, which would be very detrimental to family immigrants in particular, if all those policies had stayed in effect, you'd be looking at almost about a 49% cut in legal immigration. And we calculated that over a period of years, you would eventually see labor force growth drop by 60% or so, which would really have an impact as you move forward on economic growth as well. So for folks who argue on the anti-immigration side, they mostly argue in a very zero-sum set of arguments in which they say any new person coming in is going to take a job from someone else. But as I like to point out, if that was the case, if someone just entering the labor force meant someone else had to lose a job, then why do we celebrate at high school and college graduations? Because we would obviously think that, oh no, these are people that are going into the labor force, they're going to take someone's job. But obviously we think it's a good thing when people graduate and go into the labor force, and we shouldn't think it's a bad thing when people who haven't been foreign born enter the labor force.
Sure, no, that makes total sense. And so Giovanni, shifting gears a little bit, I think for most of us on the call, when we think of the Trump administration's take on immigration policies, right, it seems that there's sort of two main premises from which the administration, the previous administration was working. On the one hand, we have this fear, we need to protect America from this influx of terrorists and other criminals, right? And it's really playing to that sort of rhetoric. And on the other hand, and this is sort of a much longer history, we need to protect American jobs from cheap immigrant labor. That's something I think Stuart just referenced a little bit too there. I know you've done a lot of work in this area in sort of measuring that economic impact of immigration. Is there actually, based on your research, right, is there any actual basis in fact, in data for any of those claims?
So let me start with the labor market because this connects with what Stuart was saying. This idea comes from this fallacy, which one more foreign worker is one fewer American workers. The American economy is a very large body, and it creates and destroys hundreds of thousands of jobs every month. And if we want to keep having jobs, this economy has to keep growing. And to keep growing, the fact that there are people with different skills, people with different ideas, and people who bring innovation is going to be crucial. And immigrants coming in do bring the skill, the innovation, and this contribute to the growth of the economy, and so contribute to actually the creation of these jobs. Among them, in particular, the people who have high education also bring in creativity, ideas, technological progress. But also each immigrant is a consumer, so demands. Each immigrant is more likely to be an entrepreneur, so to start a firm. Each immigrant is likely to create a connection between the US and another country for American firms to export. These are all things that our research has shown are going to be very significant and very important to increase the productivity of the American system. And higher productivity means more job, increase in wage, more companies, more firms. Research, I think, over and over again has shown how, in aggregate, the positive impact of immigration, the contribution of immigrants to productivity, to growth is large. And actually, I would say, as Stuart says, it also shows that the projection for the next decade is that without immigrants, the labor force of the United States will start shrinking with an increase of burden of Social Security and other things on worker and a decline in productivity. In terms of the other part, which was immigrants are criminal, there is a very large and consistent body of work that show that, in fact, immigrants are significantly less likely to commit crimes than natives, including undocumented immigrants. The crime rate is very low. The incarceration rate of immigrants is much lower than that of American. And there is evidence that the very aggressive enforcement policies, such as deportation, such as persecution of some undocumented immigrants, have actually not brought any significant results in terms of crime reduction, but have ended up putting a lot of communities sort of in the shades and reducing their potential contribution to the local economy, to the local society. So I would say that all these images, which have been the core of the previous administration, should be debunked based on all the research that there is. And I would say, unfortunately, some of these images that have been introduced have already done some damage. We'll discuss this maybe later, but I would say that some member of the Republican Party who were willing and were to be involved in reforms, some senators of the Republican Party who would have been part of a more open immigration system 5 years ago. In fact, they were part of the those who proposed immigration reforms, now have become associated or have bought into this imagery. And I think this in the long run can be very damaging for policies. So huge need of changing this image, of bringing facts, bringing data, and go back to a vision of immigration which is more real.
And so, I think you referenced something right there that I just wanted to touch on a little bit more, which is, how strident the discourse has become around immigration, right? And it's not so much immigration based in fact and policy and data driven, it's really based in rhetoric. And so what do you think the long-term impact of that's going to be? Like, if we're basing policy on rhetoric, right, such that these Republicans can no longer feel like they can be associated with immigration reform, what's the long-term economic impact going to be for the United States if we continue down that path?
The long-run economic impact is to be very serious on two fronts. First, on the fact if we are not going to reform and have an immigration policy that allows us to continue to have the high skilled, the brains, if the H-1B visa system is not improved, reformed, expanded, all the benefits that are coming from this, so productivity growth, eventually economic growth, could slow. We will have a slower growth. We will have a society which is aging faster, which is not innovating as fast. And on the side of the labor and the worker, we will continue to have this large group of hard-working Americans who have been in the country for a decade, who are in this undocumented odd status that doesn't allow them to fulfill all their economic potential. And again, here there is a significant research that allowing them to have a documented position will increase their wages, will increase their contribution, will increase their human capital with positive effect for investment and firms. So we risk to have slow growth, an aging society, and in part this closure, and this closure can be certainly significantly damaging in the long run perspective of the US.
No, that's fascinating. And Britta, you've actually measured that, right? Like a lot of your research has been, what's the impact of essentially choking off that supply of immigrants, high skilled immigrants? So I wonder if you could provide like a little bit more insight into how does artificially restricting that supply of immigration, how does that actually impact the economy, stock prices? We already talked a little bit about labor markets.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have, I'll kind of emphasize two bodies of work that really look at like the immediate short-term impact and then like the much longer run impact. So So in terms of the short, immediate effect, so what I did was with two of my co-authors, Danny Bahar and Raj Chowdhury, we actually looked at the immediate impact of one of the Trump administration's executive orders, their June executive order, which banned about 200,000 skilled foreign workers. And these are workers, that the U.S. companies really rely on to fill talent gaps, right? So it banned them from entering the U.S. So we looked at the immediate impact of the announcement of that executive order on Fortune 500 companies' stock market valuations, okay? And so what we found is that right away, their market valuations dropped by about 0.45%. Now that may not sound like a lot. If you translate it into dollars, that's $100 billion lost, okay? And these companies' stock market prices remained below those levels for at least 10 days after the announcement. And then this was even a larger impact for Fortune 500 companies that were increasing in their reliance on H-1B visa workers, right? And so this kind of suggests that investors and markets more generally understand that when you abruptly constrain access to skilled labor, right, this affects firm performance, right? They're not able to perform as well without the ability to hire top foreign talent. So this is kind of, the very immediate impact. But I also have another body of research that's looking at kind of these longer run consequences. And specifically, I find that when multinational firms face immigration restrictions, they're actually more likely to offshore in response. So in other words, if they can't hire the foreign workers that they need in the US, they'll just hire them at their foreign affiliates instead, right? And so this kind of goes directly against kind of the standard way we talk about immigration in the classic kind of debate, where you think about firms having two options, right? They either hire Americans or they hire immigrants. And this is actually saying there's a third option, right? Which is that they just hire that foreign labor that they need at their foreign affiliates instead. And so I found that this has been happening really since about 2004, which is when the H-1B cap became really binding, okay? And so even though these policies are implemented to actually increase jobs for Americans, they're really backfiring, and they're sending a lot of jobs to other countries. And the types of countries that benefit from this, so China and India, right, which is where a lot of the talent is coming from, but also places like Canada, which have open immigration policies, right? And so firms can invest there. They know that they're not going to have problems hiring the people that they need, and so they set up there instead. So Canada has been a really major beneficiary of this. And the final thing that I want to know, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
So the final thing I want to note is just that what I've been talking about so far is jobs, but it's not just jobs, right? So there's a lot of research that shows the close links between immigrants and innovation, immigrants and investment, immigrants and startup firms, right? And what that means is that if they're going to another country instead, the US is losing out, right? So that investment, that innovation, that startup, that economic growth is going to other countries who have more open immigration policies and are more welcoming.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, and just anecdotally, I have a good friend who I tried to hire him when I was at Yahoo. He was like 16 or 17 when he was that brilliant of a developer, right? And he's like, nope, I want to go to college. He went to college, and then a large search company out in the Bay Area tried to hire him, and he said, nope, I'm going to do my own thing. And he couldn't get a visa to work here in the United States, right? And so what did he do is he took that skill and he went back to Switzerland and he built a company that he then sold in Switzerland, right? And so we lose that. So it's not that we're protecting American jobs, we're protecting American markets. What we're actually doing is shooting ourselves in the foot, both from all the way from stock market performance all the way down to the individual labor market, because we're not creating those jobs, we're not creating that innovation, we're not creating those opportunities for growth here in the U.S., which is terrifying. shifting gears a little bit, I think we've spent a lot of time focusing on what's gone wrong over the last few years. And so I'd kind of like to wrap this up a little bit by putting a little bit more of a positive spin, if you will, on it, right? So looking forward and thinking about the Biden administration and what are some of the ideas that are floating around there in terms of, what could we do as a country to sort of get back on track and revise our immigration system to drive even more economic growth than it has done. And so I wondered if each of you, if we could just kind of go down the line, maybe we'll start with Britta and we'll end on Giovanni, just because that's how you're sort of arranged on my screen. If you could just spend a couple minutes thinking about or talking about what has the Biden administration done right so far, all right? And what do you think they should be focusing on in terms of immigration reform, really as a means of driving that economic growth going forward? So if you could take, just maybe 1 or 2 minutes each and run through that, that'd be amazingly helpful, and then we'll turn it over for questions.
Yeah, so my expertise is more in skilled immigration, so I'm going to kind of focus on that particular piece. I mean, we've already talked about the procedural issues, right? So this is kind of an obvious thing that they really should be able to fairly easily start with, right? So dealing with kind of the backlog in applications, these increases in hurdles, et cetera. And none of this requires legislative change. So this should be kind of a straightforward, easy place to start. Of course, the next couple that I think are the most important are much more challenging. So one is really just reforming the H-1B visa system. It's really in real need of reform. The cap hasn't changed since 2006. Demand really far outstrips supply every single year, right? So this cap clearly needs to be expanded. Ideally, you would want to tie it to some measure of economic growth, so that you don't have to try and create new legislative change every X number of years. And then, the lottery system is pretty inefficient, right? So it's really led to the rise of outsourcing companies that disproportionately favors large companies, right? So if you think about, it gives equal priority to someone performing basic code testing, to, someone who's like a cutting edge AI researcher. That's not very efficient. And so this is something that needs to be reformed. One of these proposals, Stuart has already talked about, is kind of the wage ranking, which has its own problems. So you'd really want to couple that with, perhaps saying like this piece of the H-1B visa program is specifically bookmarked for young graduates, right? So you definitely would want to kind of, if you were going to do the wage ranking thing, it would have to be coupled with something like that. But it really needs some reform. And this is especially important because there's so much research showing that H-1B visas lead to greater productivity, lead to more innovation, lead to more startups, et cetera. And then the final thing that I would say is, it's really surprising that we don't have any kind of startup visa, right? So as I've already mentioned, the H-1B visa program tends to favor larger companies. Smaller companies are already at a disadvantage. And then in addition, startups, there is no startup visa, unlike many other comparable countries, right? So Australia has one, Canada has one, Ireland has one, Chile, Singapore. I mean, I could name countries for a while. We don't have one. And this is kind of crazy, right? Because immigrants account for a quarter of US invention and entrepreneurship, even though we don't have one. So imagine how much higher that could even be if we actually allowed immigrants to easily have startups. And this is, especially important given the ties of startup activity to economic growth. So this to me seems like one of the very clear areas where there could be some policy reform. And just as a final point, this is hard, but the degree to which this can be done via legislation rather than executive orders is important, because otherwise it can just be overturned by the next administration. So
sure, absolutely, no, that's a great point. Sir, what would you add to that?
Well, I think those are all excellent. We've done research looking at other countries' startup visas and found that's certainly something the U.S. should have. We had found that half of the billion-dollar startups had at least one immigrant founder. in America. So imagine, as Britta said, with her cat there, how many more there would be if we had good policies on H-1Bs. I think in addition to what Britta said, we also, these two regulations, again, as we've seen in the past, that, you know, these administrative policies can have a really significant effect. And getting rid of both of these regulations is really going to set the stage on any other changes that might be made. If you're going to inflate the wages that are required for not just H-1Bs, but also employment-based immigrants by 30 or 40%, as we know, when you raise the price of something, you tend to get less of it. And that was the goal of both of these measures. And there's really no reason why the Biden administration that wants to have a pro-immigration policy, should want to keep them. As far as legislation, in the proposal that the Biden administration has floated, one of the provisions would be to significantly increase the number of employment-based green cards, including by not counting the spouses and children towards the total. And if you combine that with getting rid of the per country limit, which is also very important because you have people from India waiting decades potentially, that would have a very significant impact, and in some ways would compensate for even a lack of reform on the H-1B front if you were able to come up with some sort of bridge visas for people after they finish college. So those would be the ones I would highlight.
Awesome, thank you. And Giovanni, we'll give you the last word before we open it up to questions.
Yeah, so I agree with many things. Number one, I think legislation is needed. So I think Biden should invest a lot in the proposal. The proposal he has now has a lot of things, but I would also emphasize, I'm not going to repeat what has been already said. I would point at the green card reform. The country 7% limit is terrible. I think that one terrible thing is that people who have been here on an H-1B for 6 years, 7 years, they cannot become permanent resident because they're from India or China. So that's a bottleneck that needs to be solved. I will add one other area in which I think there is going to be an important impact on human capital and growth, which has not been mentioned, which is the DREAM Act. So there is this way of addressing part of the undocumented who came in as young people, and there is an incentive for them to get a college education and get a permit and citizenship through that. There is 1.5 million of young people who can definitely be college educated and can contribute significantly. And this has been, a proposal for a very long time, part of the path to citizenship or path to documented. So I think all these elements are important. I want to again emphasize the importance of investing in a legislative solution to many of these issues. Otherwise, we keep going back and forth with the executive orders.
No, those are all great points. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it back over to Eric now to run through some audience questions, if you could.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you so much, Greg, and great discussion. So we have had audience questions come in. If you do have a question for the panel, please go ahead and type it in, and we'll try to get to it. So a couple questions to start off. Stuart noted the idea of removing the caps for green cards, but people are concerned that it will skew immigration because of the populations of countries like India and China. Are there really downsides to removing the caps?
Well, I think if you increase the numbers at the same time, that would take care of those concerns. I mean, right now you have a situation where if you're from Europe, you might be able to get an approval within a year. I mean, leaving aside the consular processing issues right now, but you might be able to get approval within a year. And if you're from India, you might get approval, be able to actually get a green card in 10, 20, 30 years or more, potentially, if you're new. So I understand why if you're doing okay under the current system, why you'd want to keep that aspect of it. And the way to solve that would be to have more green cards overall. But there were some transition measures in there to try to take care of people from the other countries, so they wouldn't have too long a wait. But the bottom line is you have a situation whereas if you don't fix it, you just have all these other people waiting for potentially decades. And so even if you aren't able to increase the number of green cards overall, there needs to be something done to address the situation.
Great, thank you. This next question, I'll leave it open for everyone to address. So it is, we heard from Canadian Immigration Minister Marco Mendicino earlier this week that there just isn't the same resistance to the idea that immigrants are job creators and not job takers. Is there something inherently different in our economies or demographics that explains why people in the United States see things so differently? And I guess we can start with Britta.
That's a tough one. I don't really think there's something, different about our economy that would mean that you would expect different results from immigration here versus in Canada. I mean, I think it's just kind of been the way that politics have evolved here, where immigrants have been kind of the easy target for a lot of negative things that happen. But no, I mean, I don't think there's anything, systematically different that would mean that, Canada and the US would get different results from more immigration.
Thank you. Giovanni?
So I would say there is a difference in the system of immigration of Canada and the United States, which may in part explain this, not in the economy. The effect of immigrants in the economy are going to be very similar. But Canada is this, point system in which the overwhelming majority of people who go in are people with relatively high level of education. And so it may be that in the mind of people, a highly educated, skilled immigrant is a good thing. For jobs and may create, but less educated is not as much. There is not as much truth. There is not necessarily, hard evidence of this, but clearly there is a difference. I would say that the Americans seem to perceive, although immigration in the last 2 decades has been in the US extremely skill intensive and declining, Americans seem to perceive this invasion of low-skilled immigrants constantly going on, maybe because the news only or mainly talk about immigration in that way. So a combination of media coverage and maybe type of immigration system could create a little bit of these differences. I think a lot of this should be kind of pushed back with more information and more research, not less.
I would say that one of the differences is that the United States shares a southern border with countries that have much lower income levels than the United States, whereas Canada shares a border with the United States. So I think that's one big factor. You don't see these images that we see and news coverage that you see in the US. Also, I would say that one of the reasons I'm not a fan of the point system and trying to adapt it here in the US is because in the Canadian system, really the government can had the equivalent of the executive branch can set any number it wants any year. And that would be an extraordinarily dangerous policy to have in the United States if you were to have that kind of policy where you have that kind of free hand to the executive. We saw what happened just in the past 4 years, even with all these statutory things that couldn't be changed and how far the numbers dropped. But in Canada, they're able to adjust the numbers and qualitative things. And that's actually one of the reasons why the system works in Canada is because they can get input from businesses and make these changes. But I think a lot of businesses would be pretty scared if you had a system where you gave almost a type of carte blanche, or you had a system where it would get locked in and couldn't be changed in terms of a point system. So it's just something to think about when we compare the two systems, that there's just a different political system and a different law that governs the two immigration systems.
Great, thank you all for addressing that question. Next question, again, I'll leave it open and everyone can chime in. What about geographic-based immigration policy like the Heartland visa that has been discussed? Does immigration policy need to be set more at the local level, or at least take that into consideration more than federal policy has historically? And I guess, Giovanni, if we can start with you.
Yeah, so I have always been a fan of the idea that local conditions are very important, and American states have very different economies and sometimes needs. So their input in sort of shaping the type of immigration that the U.S. receives is important. These the visa, the Heartland visa, as you call them, the idea that there are some places in the United States that could be revitalized by the inflow of immigrants, and where Americans tend to move out, and there is need for doctors, need for professionals, and there would be immigrants which are interested in going, and by doing so they will stimulate the local economy. I think it is an interesting and good idea. Already without that visa, the internal mobility of foreign-born in the United States is such that they are much more mobile and responsive to the economic condition, in particular those who are less educated. So highly educated always do that. But in the US, there is this strong evidence in recent research that the less educated foreign workers tend to go where potential opportunities are, and they tend to be one important engine of local revitalization. So yes, I do think that immigration in the US has important local impact, and cities, mayors, states should have a say in federal policy and should help shape the number and the type of immigrants that come in.
Giovanni, as a follow-up, curious to hear, what about initiatives to drive immigrants with specific sorts of skills where we have shortages, like nurses? Anything relevant you're aware of or that you would propose to address?
Well, there have been some cities, specifically some mayors, and some which have sort of suggested that immigrants are welcome in their places, and they have even signaled sort of what type of job where they're available. The problem is that, at the local level, people are really tied in their hands. They're not going to be able, because there is no, the immigration policy is federal. So there have been definitely some local interesting action in, the office of the mayor of New York, the office of other mayor, who have tried to, for instance, incentivize immigrants to come, or immigrants to get citizenship when they are available, to become more invested local citizens. And those are all interesting ideas, I think, in part limited by the fact that the real power for immigration laws is federal, but definitely to be followed up. Some states have decided to give some, immigrant, even undocumented, form of legal documents to allow them to operate there. So it's all a patchwork at this stage, because there is not a coordinated effort. But I think, as I said, that there are interesting local initiatives that we should follow up on.
Great, thank you so much. I guess Britta and Stuart, if you wanted to chime in on the original question regarding the Heartland visa, please feel free, and then I'll hand it back to Greg to close us out.
I mean, I'll just briefly say that I think this is a sensible idea. I'd be interested. I think it might be difficult logistically, just because the federal government is the one that sets policies, right? So how exactly it would work is a challenge, but it certainly could be a very good tool for revitalizing certain areas, or for, making sure that there are, doctors and nurses were two of the professions that were raised. We know that we have a shortage of those in like rural areas, for example. So it could be a way to deal with that. So yeah, I mean, I think overall this is a sensible idea.
I would say a variation of that. The Biden administration has talked about pilot project to allow people to help sponsor refugees, and I think that's an excellent idea. And it would allow, I think, a lot of Americans would be happy to directly help people. And I think if you're not able to do something legislatively with something like the Heartland visa, at least allowing Americans a chance to participate through their, through their religious organizations or in other ways, and to help refugees. I think that's something that would be welcome, and that's something that can be done administratively.
And there's definitely been precedent for that, right? I mean, everything from foreign medical graduates going back to the 70s through some of the different refugee programs that were set up. We've definitely seen some of that historically. So, I could personally geek out on this all day. I love this. I wanted to thank you. I know we're at time, a little bit over actually. So unfortunately, we do have to conclude for the day. But I wanted to thank Britta, Stuart, and Giovanni for the really rich, robust discussion we had here today, as well as to everyone who joined in for the fantastic questions and taking time out of their day to learn more about what our leading academics here are thinking about in terms of where we're headed, where we should be headed, and what are the things that we could do to both improve the U.S. immigration system, but also help encourage and foster economic growth as a result of that. So thanks to all of you for joining in, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.